And sort of while you're still getting settled, I asked Bob if he would play Aurelia, a tune you know, and I'll say just a little bit about it. It's a kind of introduction to this wonderful Wesley family, which is, Bob could defend better than I, bears some resemblance to the Bach family. I think that's they're not quite on the same level of musicianship, but at least 3 or 4 generations you have before you. So, Aurelia. That's that. Yep. Does it have a cipher? Somehow meant something to me when I didn't believe anything and was about 20 years old. And I didn't know until this past week that the composer is Charles Wesley's grandson, Samuel Sebastian. So on the picture side of this, you will see a reference to him. He also composed other hymns. My thanks to Bob, who was not in the bulletin announcement, but has been a great support to me. We sat over coffee a week or 2 ago and talked about this kind of thing. And I said to him at one point, isn't it true, Bob, that Martin Luther and composers of other early hymns actually stole folk songs, songs that were sometimes sung with bawdy lyrics. And Bob came back to me and said, oh yes, he said, Martin Luther famously said, the devil shouldn't have all the good tunes. I love the line. Thank you for your help and your support, Bob. Thanks to you, Pam. Where are you, Pam? Still setting up chairs for navigating adult education as you have for, I'm going to say a decade, maybe it hasn't been that long. Thanks to my wife, who will play one of the hymns later after Bob has to leave. She put in a request playfully a week or 2 ago for anyone who has a hymnal that is full of hymns with no sharps and no flats. But she really is much better than that indicates. She also puts up with an awful lot of unholy fretting on my part. As I try to put talks and sermons together, she wipes up the dining room table when it's loaded with eraser dust, because I always have to try and get it right, you know. To make it a worthy offering, of course, but also so I look good, you know. And he knows that. You might as well struggle with that stuff. And Bunny, where are you? Is Bunny here? Bunny Fazekas? Am I pronouncing it right? Bunny may be saying a few words later about how you may go about the process of writing a hymn, if you want to do so, using one of the tunes in the hymnal. Now, I promised some theology, so I will offer you some. And, oh, by the way, this is a World War II era folding SD organ, which was used on shipboard as well as in the field by the armed forces during the Second World War. This is maybe 1940 something. That one, though it's been cleaned up, is the one you heard last week, and it was built in 1926 and is of the type that was used in the first book. I thought I'd pass around with you what these things are full of, lest this sound like a meeting of the Society for the Preservation of the Reed Organ. I thought you might like to see the little brass reeds that line up inside, on top of valves inside a reed organ. So pass it around if you want. Theology, and this is very much, as I hear it, in tune with what Chick was saying in his sermon. So hang in there for the first several sentences, which may sound like it is not, but it's just a wonderful quote from an Anglican bishop who is really one of the heroes and saints of the world, I think, by absolutely anyone's definition these days. In a book called God is Not a Christian and Other Provocations, he writes this. My first point, and I have puzzled about this, maybe you have, ever since I was a child. And I just love the words that he puts to this. My first point seems overwhelmingly simple. That the accidents of birth and geography determine to a very large extent to what faith we belong. The chances are very great that if you were born in Pakistan, you are a Muslim. If you were born in India, a Hindu, or a Shintoist, if your birthplace was Japan, and a Christian if you were born in Italy, I don't know what significant, so modest, I don't know what significant fact can be drawn from this. Perhaps that we should not succumb too easily to the temptation to exclusiveness and dogmatic claims to a monopoly of the truth of our particular faith. You could so easily have been an adherent of the faith that some are now denigrating, but for the fact that you were born here rather than there. He goes on. My second point is this. Not to insult the adherents of other faiths by suggesting, as sometimes has happened, that, for instance, when you are a Christian, the adherents of other faiths are really Christians without knowing it. We must acknowledge them for who they are in all their integrity, with their conscientiously held beliefs. We must welcome them and respect them as who they are, and walk reverently on what is their holy ground, taking off our shoes metaphorically and literally. But, and he says, it's kind of a both-and thing. We must hold to our particular and peculiar beliefs tenaciously, not pretending that all religions are the same, for they are patently not the same. We must be ready to learn from one another, not claiming that we alone possess all truth and that somehow we have a corner on God. We should, in humility and joyfulness, acknowledge that the supernatural and divine reality we all worship in some form or other transcends all our particular categories of thought and imagination. And that, because the divine, however named, however apprehended or conceived, is infinite, and we are forever finite, we shall never comprehend the divine completely. What that says to me is that it is quite possible to be humble and open to truth wherever God has put it, while at the same time being anchored in a particular faith. Someone has said that if you want to find water, it's good not to dig 6 dozen holes so deep, but to dig one down to the water. Now, let me combine that with something Dr. Pittenger at General Seminary used to say occasionally, because we're gathered here, celebrating hymns of praise to the God, the triune God whom we worship. Dr. Pittenger was about 6'3", white-haired, a wonderful voice, a magnificent presence, an eloquent lecturer, author of 60 books. The people on the faculty couldn't stand it, you know. He wrote so many books. So they used to come up to him and say, knowing that he repeated some of the same themes, "Well, what did you call it this time, Norman?" Norman said, "God doesn't need our praises, but he knows that it's good for us to offer them. Good for us to offer them." And follow that up with David Foster Wallace' comment. Let's see. If you don't, he said, if you don't ascribe ultimate worth to God, then you ascribe ultimate worth to something else. And he goes on to say, almost anything else you ascribe ultimate worth to can eat you alive. Can eat you alive. Which reminded me this morning of a wonderful hymn, "Oh, for a closer walk with God," one line of which is, "The dearest idol I have known, whate'er that idol be, help me to tear it from thy throne and worship only thee." So, I'm well aware that that opens up maybe a whole subject of discussion. But let me move on. I do want to hear from you, and I treasured your comments last time. Some loose ends from last week, and then on to the age of the Wesleys and the stuff that I handed out to you, and also the age of John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace. And we won't get to him this week. It's a good subject for the last session, I think. And I hate to sound like a schoolmarm, but I have a sort of schoolmarm question. Which of Isaac Watts's hymns do the English call sometimes their second national anthem?
That'd be Amazing Grace.
That was Newton. Yeah. Not Watts, though Newton was inspired by Watts' hymns. Which of Watts's hymns? Oh, and we didn't sing it last week. "Oh God, our help in ages past." Sung at those moments of English history of great joy and great peril. "Oh God, our help." Isaac Watts. That's last week. And as we said last week, Watts chiefly dealt for a while with paraphrases of Psalms. How am I doing with time? Paraphrases of Psalms. But he was the one who began to break the mold of writing hymns only in the words of Scripture. And he began to write hymns that were personal and subjective. And so last week, we looked at "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." What's one of the lines? "When I survey the wondrous cross," a couple of lines. "Sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet? Or thorns compose so rich a crown? And then that wonderful last verse. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my life, my soul, my all. Very personal hymn. So Watts broke the mold. Did any of you come up with a favorite hymn of your own that you might not have mentioned last week, or a favorite line from a hymn? Anybody? Of course, we've thought about this all week. Thank you.
I like number 318, but I don't remember what it's called or what the words are.
Say it again.
Number 318, I don't remember which.
318. Thank you. In the 1940 or the 1982?
In the one in the church.
In the one in the church. Yeah. I've got that somewhere. I'd like to look it up. Anybody else? Yes.
The Navy hymn, the Eternal Father, strong to say.
Eternal Father, strong to say. Yes. Any others? Yes.
Jerusalem. Or did those feet in ancient time?
And did those feet in ancient? Yeah. Not actually in the hymn, but
Okay.
yes, yes.
That's another answer. That's almost an English national anthem.
Almost an English
William
anthem.
Blake.
William Blake. Thank you. Yeah. Good.
One of my very favorites is A Mighty Fortress, Luther.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
How great thou art.
Yeah, beg pardon.
Song paraphrase.
How great thou
Song
art.
paraphrase. Yes.
How great thou art.
How great thou art. Is that in the 82?
No, it's not.
Yeah, no, but it probably is one of the, in one of the,
Lift every voice.
it's in Lift Every Voice. Yeah. All right. Okay. Any others? All right. I'd like to get, I'm trusting that you got a chance at least to peruse some of the information on this. On the back page, we'll go over it in some detail with some amplification in a couple of minutes. But let me see. And I'd like you to know something about the times that the Wesleys lived in, but I also want you to be able to sing one of the personal subjective hymns that Charles Wesley wrote among 6,500 others. Where is Anne? Is Anne still here? You know what clergy had to do in the 1600s? Or what they did anyway? After each sermon, and the sermons went on for 2 hours sometimes, they wrote a hymn that encapsulated the meaning of the sermon. So maybe that's why there were so many. Anyway, Charles had 3 personal experiences after his ordinations. Kind of interesting how Charles and John were ordained, and after that came the conversion experience. Interesting. Charles had 3 experiences that would have shaken any of us probably to our boots. One was on shipboard coming back from Georgia, from Savannah, Georgia. There was a storm. All the sheep on board were washed overboard. Half the hogs went overboard. All the chickens or other fowl were drowned. And the captain finally, at the last minute, had to cut off the mizzenmast to save the ship. And he was terrified. And he prayed with some friends. This is 1738. And another experience was he was ill with pleurisy and dysentery, and had a long-standing fever. And in the midst of that illness, he had a vision of Mrs. Marbury, the owner of the house in which he was staying, coming into his room and saying, "Trust in Christ and you will be healed." And as it turned out, he was healed. And as it also turned out, Mrs. Marbury wasn't even in the house at the time. And the third experience was his ministry to a black slave who had stolen some money from his master and who was about to go to the gallows. We'll say more about the penal system later. Those three experiences would be enough. As it turned out, the black man, through Charles's ministry to him, went to the gallows serene. It's a wonderful story. So, I thought that might help you to respect some of the depths of one of the hymns you've got in your packet, Jesus, Lover of My Soul, which he wrote in 1740. By the way, on board ship, he worshipped with Moravians, steal 30 seconds more, with Moravians, Germans, who were great singers, and very, very devout, here is what he says. It might have been the same storm, it might have been another. He asked a Moravian how he and his fellow Moravians maintained such calmness in the midst of the storm. Quote, "In the midst of the psalm wherewith our service began, the sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks. A terrible screaming began among the English." I'm not criticizing. The Germans looked up and without intermission calmly sang on. Charles, I asked one of them afterwards, "Was you not afraid?" He answered, "Thank God, no." And the Moravians had a profound influence on the Wesleys, really. Yeah. So, Bob is still here. Jesus, Lover of My Soul, would you please stand and sing it as the Welsh sing with full voice. it's hard, but when I recall the ship and all that, it's sometimes, I have to anyway, remind myself, there was no Tylenol in those days, no aspirin, no antibiotics, no appliances to wash your clothes. In most cases, outhouses. And as Brian McLaren said in Portland a couple of years ago when we heard him speak, not even kings back in those days had the benefit of a hot shower. There were all kinds of ways in your life you could hit bottom, as sometimes 12-step people say. And you needed to reach for a strength that was not your own. All right. Now, any phrases or words or anything that touches you from that hymn that we just sang out of Charles Wesley's experience? Don't have to defend it. You don't even have to have one that jumped out at you. Yes.
Hide me.
Hide me. Okay. Yeah. Legitimate. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
similar to Rock of Ages.
Similarity to Rock of Ages. Yeah.
Cliff for me.
Interesting. Yes, yes. A century later. So, yeah, yeah. Yes.
This is
I
the storm.
there's a column that ends with our gracious, O lover of soul. And I love the lover of my soul here. And that's,
Yeah.
it's such a tender image.
Lover of my soul.
Yeah.
The wonderfulness of it, the bright side of it, and the dark side of it too. All loved. As Tillich said, you are accepted. Yeah. Yeah. Any others?
Receive my soul at last.
Receive. Who said that? Thank you. At last. Yeah. Yeah. Receive my soul at last. Yeah. Others? Okay. Just to give you an appreciation, please, of the Wesleys and their time, I need to go to this wonderful man, Albert Bailey, again. He researched these hymns in 2 different Oxford libraries, in the British Museum in London, in the archives of Harvard University, at Union Seminary, spoke with professors at Princeton Theological Seminary, any number of sources. Here is what he says about the times, the age of the Wesleys, which was an eye-opener to me, I guess, because I haven't studied this for 50, 60 years, and 50 or 60 years ago it might not have meant the same thing at all. Speaking of England, from all accounts, that social structure was in sad need of a revolution, which never came, by the way, partly because of the work of the Wesleys and the spiritual awakening that they helped in sad need of a revolution. Beneath the wealthy upper classes who were completely worldly, largely callous and immoral, and the self-satisfied middle class who had little to complain of, was the vast sodden throng of the underprivileged, neglected by church and state alike. These people existed in a condition little above savagery. They were, that sounds strong, but listen. They were brutalized by a penal code and a prison system which staggers the present-day imagination. Adults and even children of both sexes could be legally hanged for 160 different offenses, from picking a pocket for more than a shilling to snaring a rabbit on a gentleman's estate in this squirearchy. Charles Wesley writes in his journal that he preached in jail to 52 felons waiting to be hanged, among them being a child of 10. One of the most popular shows was the mass hangings held every 6 weeks at Tyburn Hill, London. All of this, the spiritual awakening was to touch. For lesser crimes, there were the pillory, not sure what it is, the stocks, I know what that is, the scold's bridle, the whipping post, the branding iron, transportation to the West Indies for slavery, and the atrocious jail. John Wesley wrote in a letter to the London Chronicle, nice he wrote letters to the editor in those days, great way to communicate, January 2, 1761, of all the seats of woe this side of hell, few, I suppose, exceed or even equal London's Newgate prison. If you can bear with 4 more sentences. Harlotry was scandally flourishing among all classes. Gin drinking became a national curse and was responsible for much of the crime and a good deal of the poverty. Think of present-day parallels. In 1750, the consumption of this, quote, cheap, fiery, poisonous drink, unquote, was 11 million gallons. In the parish of St. Giles, London, out of 2,000 houses, more than 1 in every 4 was a gin shop. How's that? I like this, though I didn't fully understand it at first. The sign on many of these gin shops read, drunk for 1 penny, dead drunk, 2pence, free straw, which wasn't the straw through which you sipped the gin. It was a free bed of straw to sleep it off. This was such a profitable business that the manufacturers of liquor became wealthy, and the trade became a vested interest in which many who were high in the church and state had an interest. High in the established church of England. Lots of lazy priests in those days. Well paid, £300 a year, and they would, for £50, hire a curate to do all the pastoral work for them. They would lead morning and evening prayer, they would baptize and bury and marry. That was it. They had a very good work. All right. This black situation, and I think this is very interesting, this black situation became a challenge to the 3 great evangelists. I guess that was George Whitefield as well. They tackled the problem of reform of these institutions, reforming the care, reforming health, reforming the prisons, reforming life in general. They tackled the problem of reform not from the economic or social point of view, but from the religious. There were others who did tackle the reforms and did pass the legislation and so on. They believed that the Spirit of God could change the hearts of people, could make them desire a better life here, and trusting in the saving power of God through Christ, could break the chains of sin and cause them to rise to a sobriety and dignity which was theirs by right. Last sentence. Historians can trace the revolutionary effects of their preaching in all fields. Personal morality, health, politics, the penal code got changed. Forget the name of the man who... There was one man who really took this on as an issue for social change. Class barriers, economic and personal slavery, education, literature, music, and the religious life of all sects. They were reformers, but reformers of the soul. Reformers of the soul first. And they left it to others to do the work in Parliament and to form groups that would lift up, change, transform the penal code in the prisons. So, So I think that kind of background is, at least to me, was very helpful. John Howard is the name of the man who took on the prison reform system. William Wilberforce, have any of you seen the movie Amazing Grace? William Wilberforce, an attorney, who came to John Newton and said, gee, I really want to become a priest. And John Newton said, you stay in Parliament, that's where you're needed. And in 1807, his was the legislation that ended the slave trade in England. A guy, John Newton, turned away from becoming ordained. Earl of Shaftesbury, pioneer of social legislation. Okay. Now, where are we for time? Not so bad. Would you just take that crude PowerPoint sheet for a moment? Let me run through it a little bit. The back side of it, not the picture side. John Wesley and Charles were Parsons kids. I like that because Rhonda and I have a couple of Parsons kids. Their father was one of the 50 pounds a year clergy. He was thrown into debtor's prison on any number of occasions. All right, but these guys changed a degenerate society, spiritually, one soul at a time. John was the founder of Methodism. He was in the Church of England. Charles stayed in it all his life, for all its weaknesses and stuff. John Wesley separated in 1744. Look at the education. I mean, that's a PhD plus in our time. John was saved by a hair's breadth from a rectory. We'd call this traumatic stress, right? He was saved from a rectory fire at the age of 6. His mother, Susanna, was ill. They got her out. One man stood on the shoulders of others, and Jackie jumped from the second story into the hands of someone who called him Jackie, John Wesley. Converted at least 100,000 people, traveled 20 to 60 miles a day on horseback. The figures say 250,000 miles this guy covered, mostly on a great organizer. He was the operations guy, was a tremendous preacher as well. Both of these guys were short. Both of them had great vocal cords, and they must have had tremendous lungs, because John, as you'll see, at the age of 50, got galloping consumption. What's that? TB, right? Yeah. Survived until he was 90. I mean, think of that. Now, I thought 250,000 miles was, I wondered, for all his academic credentials and stuff, and libraries in Oxford and so on. I did the math on that. He preached for 56 years. That's 19,400 days. You know what that comes to per day? Only 12 miles. And sometimes he covered 60. So, a voluminous reader. He would do it on horseback, a lot of it. I can't imagine staying on the horse. But, he'd have these volumes, which were large. He'd have them in his saddlebags. And he would hold the book with both hands and drop the reins and ride on. He knew, Whit, you'll appreciate this, he knew Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, preached in German, French, and Italian, and he learned to pray in Spanish. How's that? How's that? Apparently very even-tempered. He didn't lose it. He was an organizational genius, would have been an MBA maybe. He trained 600 lay leaders to run these different classes. I'll describe those in a moment. He was singing among those Germans after they got back from Savannah, Georgia, and had some kind of conversion experience as he was singing with the Germans. He translated numerous German hymns by people like Gerhard Terstegen, if I got that right, and Zinzendorf. I translated one of my favorite hymns, Thou hidden love of God, whose height, whose depth, unfathomed, no one knows. So he was a great translator. Taught hymns to all manner of congregations in all places. And I'm going to read a shortened version of the circumstances under which he sang hymns, if I can find it. Yeah. I reduced a lot of material for a sermon I was very privileged to do at Bob Morris's 40th anniversary celebration of his ordination a number of years ago. And Bob asked me to come on John and Charles Wesley Day, which is March 3rd in the lectionary, Lesser Feasts and Fasts. So, reducing, unfortunately, for time's sake, a lot of the detail that Bailey gives. It was in small groups. This is a parish of small groups. Think of the connections. It was in those small groups, classes they were called, led by the 600 lay leaders that John had trained. It was in those small groups that folks were transformed. Meeting in an old rural schoolhouse, for example, the people from the surrounding countryside would come. Get this. Coal miners, after 12 hours down in the hole. Sheep herders, poor farmers, alcoholics, folks with injuries, bad hips or knees, and one of John's lay pastors would welcome each person at the door. Welcome, sister. How's your daughter doing? The lamb that broke its leg. How's it coming along? Good evening, brother. Lay people would do that. There would soon be a hymn, at least one, and usually a Wesleyan, taught sometimes line by line and rehearsed. We won't do it in that fashion here, but Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, and then the group would sing it, and then to the next one, and then the next one. There was extemporaneous prayer. They didn't grab, as I did when I was first ordained. You know, they didn't take their prayer book and read right out of the prayer book to this poor person lying in a hospital bed. It came from their hearts, these people. Extemporaneous prayer. Folks could engage in soul talk. How's it going with your soul? Fred Buechner said that's not the kind of question they asked at Harvard Divinity School, but they did ask it, and maybe less intellectual. Sometimes there would be a question, what's God done for your soul since we last came together? Matters of conscience and personal responsibility were elements in this sharing. People's dark side in those gatherings found a field of grace and truth. They could share what was really going on. People worked toward greater kindness and forgiveness in their relationships, greater acceptance of themselves as sinners saved by grace. That's what these classes were all over. Rural, Western England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, at least. All right, where was I? While in Savannah, Georgia, John published a collection of psalms and hymns. One of the things that Bob said to me when we had coffee a couple of weeks ago was he thought that, well, certainly the first hymnal printed was this one, in this country. The first hymnal printed in this country was that one. He edited his brother's hymns. That's his main contribution to hymnody. Hymns were their way of doing Christian education. I can identify with it because I didn't go to church school. I went to choir, and I learned a lot. All right, so that's John, the organizer. Charles, 18th child of Susanna and Sandy. That's why I put Susanna's name in bold up at the top. They had 19 children. 8 of them died. My brother recently went to a cemetery in Brooklyn. Found he didn't expect to find a Niese headstone, and then he got the information. I learned that my grandfather and grandmother buried 2 of their children within weeks of each other. One was 3, and one was something like 3 months. And so I kind of fantasized, not a pious thing, but fantasized this little family gathered around the grave, saying prayers together. They did this 8 times. Prolific hymn writer, 6,500. Difficult schoolboy experience. Was a very punitive system. He was an undersized kid, but he once stood up to a kid smaller than himself who was being bullied. It was a great moment. Okay. What can I think I've covered some of this. Finally married at the age of 42. And I've read to you the Newgate prison thing. The hymn, Jesus, Lover of My Soul, really sort of set the style for hymns that people know so well nowadays. What a friend we have in Jesus. Any gospel hymn of a personal sort. So, now, we have, I think, time for 2 hymns. And I'm sorry, I'm probably not getting a lot in, but I'll try and I wanted to hear more from you. I'm sorry. Next week, save your thoughts, comments. Would you turn to one of, to my mind, the most magnificently simple hymns in the entire hymnal. It was number 1 in the 1940 hymnal. And I always felt good about that. I always thought it was especially important. It came to believe, especially it was. Number 66 in your, and if you would sing it, you can stay seated for this because I want you to stand for the last hymn. Everybody. Something that our organist at my last church used to do. You'll identify quickly enough, I think. Ready, by thine own, ready. Yes, I won't forget it. She practiced it. We're going to do it. Any phrases jump out at you that you love, particularly from that hymn? Just the literary merit of alone, I'm very impressed with. Yes?
I like born to set thy people free.
Free. Yes. And from our fears. What kinds of fears? Yeah. Yeah. You know what I think a deep fear is? That Macbeth had it right. It's a tale, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. From that fear releases, and in my experience, as yours, he does. All right, I was going to get into theology. But it's 5 after. We're doing Heart Marrow. Yes. I don't know how many people are aware that this phenomenal man, Charles Wesley, wrote Heart Marrow. So, we'll get to theology next time. I'd love to go next time into what you do when you run into a hymn that has a theological verse that you don't quite resonate to.